Well, good evening, folks, and welcome back to Delta Deep. This is your host, Roscoe, broadcasting live from the heart of the Delta, surrounded by nothing but the silence of the night and, well, a few noisy crickets. Can't forget about them now, can we? Now, before we get started with our usual spook-filled affairs, let me tell you about the comical misadventure that I had today. You see, it all started when I decided to try my hand at some good old-fashioned baking. Yep, that's right, folks. Yours truly thought he could whip up a batch of homemade biscuits. A piece of cake, right? Well, let's just say things didn't go quite as planned. I should have known something was amiss when my old dog, Scooter, made himself scarce the moment I put on that apron. But you know, I'm a man who takes pride in his southern grit and tenacity. So I rolled up my sleeves, sifted my flour, cut in my butter, and boy, oh boy, I was ready to give old Betty Crocker a run for her money. But, bless my heart, I had forgotten one tiny detail. A certain Mrs. Roscoe Jennings, my dearly beloved, the beacon of sanity in my otherwise chaotic existence. You see, friends, the kitchen is her sanctum sanctorum, her battlefield, and, well, I had unwittingly trespassed. By the time my biscuits had come out of the oven, more like rocks than anything you'd want to eat, mind you, Mrs. Jennings was standing at the kitchen entrance. She had that look. You married folks out there know the one I'm talking about, the kind that makes you feel like you've accidentally disturbed a voodoo ritual. All she said was, "Roscoe, dear, next time you get a hankering to create a culinary disaster, at least have the decency to use store-bought dough." Then she walked off, leaving me with my hard-as-rock biscuits and a bruised ego. Lesson learned, folks. Stick to what you know, and in my case, that means sticking to late-night radio and leaving the baking to the pros. Or, more precisely, to Mrs. Roscoe Jennings. So, now that we're all warmed up and I've finished my little rant, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of why you're all tuned in to Delta Deep. We've got quite the lineup tonight, starting with a listener's chilling tale, followed by our ever-popular Roscoe's Weekly Tale. Stay tuned, folks, because it's going to be a ride you don't want to miss. All right, settle down, settle down. It's time for our Listener's Tale segment. Tonight, we have a chilling tale from a longtime listener. This tale has been passed down in their family, originating from their grandmother, all the way from the frostbitten plains of Russia. Can you imagine? Now, that's what I call a family legacy. For the sake of privacy, let's call our listener Anton. Anton's tale takes us back, way back to the early 1920s. The world was in the grip of change. In Russia particularly, it was a time of unrest and revolution. Anton's grandmother was born in a small, remote village nestled deep in the heartland of Russia. The village was a quaint, huddled collection of humble wooden cottages, each chimney puffing out smoke into the frigid air. Life was hard yet simple, with a strong sense of community binding the villagers together. In the heart of the village was a squat little tavern which doubled as the town meeting place. There, under the dull, flickering glow of a solitary gas lamp, the villagers would gather, sharing stories and laughter as they warmed their chilled bones with homemade vodka. There was Ivan, the burly farmer, Marfa, the kind midwife, and little Anya, who could outrun every boy in the village despite her missing shoe. It was home to people who knew no life beyond their daily toil, harsh winters, and the comforting familiarity of their neighbors' faces. Despite the isolation and hardships, the villagers took solace in their sense of unity and shared struggles. That is, until the unexplained disappearances began casting a long, haunting shadow over their tight-knit community. But we're not quite there yet, folks. First, we need to understand what was happening around this time in the wider world. You see, the ripples of the Russian Revolution were reaching even the most secluded corners of the vast country. Now, amidst the tumultuous changes, the tranquil life of Anton's grandmother's village started to unravel. The first disappearance happened one bone-chilling winter night. A sturdy woodsman named Fyodor, known for his boisterous laughter that echoed through the tavern, failed to return home from the dense surrounding forest. While tragic, the villagers attributed it to a possible accident or the merciless winter cold. Life, as it does, moved on. Anton's grandmother, let's call her Nadia, was a lively young girl at the time. She had a best friend, Katya, who lived in the house across the village square. They were inseparable, two peas in a pod, sharing everything from secrets to the last slice of black bread on lean days. They would sit on the hill overlooking the village, whispering dreams of adventure into the frozen winds, their laughter echoing through the silent expanse. Nadia's fondest memory was their secret pact to explore the world beyond their village one day, a pact sealed with a small tarnished locket that Katya had found, half buried in the snow, which they took turns wearing. But as winter deepened, so did the mystery. More villagers started vanishing. Strong, able-bodied men, delicate grandmothers. With each disappearance, a wave of fear swept through the village. The once bustling tavern now lay silent, and laughter was replaced with hushed whispers and darting glances, and yet they had no idea what was lurking around the corner. But before we dive into the heart of this mystery, let's take a moment to imagine what it must have been like for Nadia and Katya, two innocent souls caught in a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty, their dreams of exploration taking on a sinister hue. One day in late November, Katya went about her daily routine, delivering freshly baked bread to the neighboring homes. Mrs. Petrov, the elderly woman living at the edge of the village, remarked that Katya seemed particularly joyful that day, sharing a new song she had learned from a traveling bard. However, as the sun set, casting long, eerie shadows across the cobblestone streets, a chilling wind blew through the town. The usually bustling streets grew silent. Katya had not returned. Panic quickly gripped the close-knit community. Search parties were formed, lanterns lit, and the townsfolk combed every nook and cranny. They searched the woods, the nearby caves, even the old abandoned well at the center of the town square, but Katya was nowhere to be found. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Many had given up hope on Katya now, but not Nadia. Young Nadia, bless her heart, was right there in the thick of it, lending a hand in the search. So it was on one misty morning that Nadia, determined and full of resolve, ventured deeper into the woods than she ever had before. The tall pine trees swayed eerily, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the whispers of the wind. She trudged on, driven by a combination of hope and the unsettling silence of the woods. After what felt like hours, Nadia stumbled upon a hidden clearing. In the center of this clearing stood a dilapidated wooden shed, its old door hanging ajar. Now, any sensible person might have turned back or called for help, but Nadia, fueled by a mix of desperation and grief, inched closer. Inside, the shed was dimly lit by the pale light that sneaked in through the gaps in the wood. Shelves lined the walls, covered in dust and filled with a hodgepodge of objects, from old jars filled with unknown liquids to strange metallic instruments. But what caught Nadia's attention the most were the various items meticulously wrapped with threads, each placed like a revered artifact. Shaking with fear, Nadia's eyes darted from one object to the next until her gaze settled on a familiar tarnished locket. It was the very locket she and Katya had shared, the symbol of their friendship and dreams, but now it bore a sinister mark. The locket was bound tightly with a silvery thread that, upon closer inspection, was unmistakably Katya's hair. As Nadia examined the locket, an unfamiliar noise broke the heavy silence. The sound of footsteps, shuffling and uneven, approached the shed. A jolt of fear surged through her, making her drop the locket. She could not be found here, not in this place that seemed to be the epicenter of the village's fears. Desperate for a hiding spot, Nadia's gaze landed on a slightly ajar cabinet tucked into a dark corner of the shed. Without a second thought, she darted towards it, squeezing herself inside and pulling the door almost closed, leaving just enough space to peer out. The footsteps grew louder until the door of the shed creaked open, revealing a tall, shadowy figure. But before we delve further into Nadia's harrowing ordeal, I think it's about time we took a short break. Sorry about this, but I need a moment to catch my breath. Stay tuned, and we'll be right back after this message. And we're back, folks. Hope y'all had a chance to stretch them legs and maybe grab a cold one from the fridge. Thanks for sticking with me through that ad break. Now let's dive right back into the thick of it, shall we? As Nadia peered through the gaps of an old wooden cabinet she had hidden behind, the rustling outside grew closer. Soon the rickety door of the shed opened with a protesting creak. Silhouetted against the dim moonlight was Ivan, a once respected member of their community. His wife and young son had vanished early that winter, and the man that walked in now bore but little resemblance to the robust, cheerful Ivan everyone once knew. His clothes, once the fabric of a proud farmer, were tattered and mud-caked. His face, unshaven for what must have been weeks, was gaunt, with shadows under his eyes suggesting countless sleepless nights. He reeked of home-brewed alcohol, a bitter, sour scent that quickly filled the small space of the shed. Every step he took was a struggle, his feet dragging along the floor. Talking to himself, or perhaps to something unseen, Avon's voice trembled between anger and desperation. "I've given everything, take me, I need to be with them." His slurred words were painful to hear, bearing the weight of his grief. He staggered about the shed, occasionally clutching at the threaded knickknacks, his fingers brushing over the one bound with Katya's hair. Every touch seemed to send him deeper into his anguish. Tears streamed down his face, making clean trails through the grime. Suddenly, he stopped, his breathing heavy. Slowly, he turned towards the cabinet Nadia was hiding behind. Their eyes met, his filled with a mix of shock, recognition, and a haunting despair. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved, the only sound being Ivan's ragged breathing and the distant whisper of wind outside. The realization that Nadia had witnessed his raw, broken state seemed to sober him up slightly. The room was thick with tension, a myriad of questions hanging in the air. "I said leave, girl!" Ivan's voice cracked with a desperation Nadia had never heard before. With surprising strength for someone in his state, he lurched toward her, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip, intending to pull her out of the shed. But in his intoxicated condition, his feet betrayed him, and he stumbled forward. Acting on instinct, Nadia caught him before he hit the ground, his body feeling frail and light in her arms. The rough wool of his shirt felt thin and inadequate against the chill, and even through it, she could feel the unnatural prominence of his bones. As she steadied him, her fingers brushed against the side of his head, and she recoiled slightly at the sensation of bare patches where thick hair once grew. Looking closer, she realized he had plucked clumps of hair from his scalp, leaving behind red, irritated skin. "Lord above Avon," Nadia whispered, her voice thick with concern. "What in God's name happened to you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a moment to regain his balance, leaning heavily on her. I'm sorry, Nadia." He managed, his voice hoarse. "This place, it's cursed. I just wanted to find them, to be with them again." As they emerged from the shed, the cold night air wrapped around them, but it was Avon's sudden halt that truly sent a shiver down Nadia's spine. He looked up, his gaze fixed on a seemingly ordinary tree illuminated faintly by the moon's light. His face drained of color and his breath came in ragged gasps. "Look," he whispered, his voice trembling. Nadia strained her eyes, trying to make out what had so terrified the man. She saw the tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Behind it, 2 stars twinkled in the clear night sky. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, yet the terror in Avon's eyes was unmistakable. "What is it?" she asked, her own fear growing. But Avon just shook his head, seemingly unable to tear his gaze away from the tree and the stars behind it. With a force Nadia didn't know he possessed, Ivan pushed her away, his eyes wild with fear and determination. "Run, Nadia, run, and don't look back!" She began to protest, her feet glued to the spot, but the desperate urgency in his voice propelled her into action. "Go!" he shouted again, almost a scream. She turned on her heel and sprinted away, her heart racing and her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Even as she ran, a part of her couldn't help but glance over her shoulder. The sight that met her eyes was one she would never forget. Avon, standing tall, his arms raised high and his head lowered, seemingly in surrender to whatever loomed in front of him. The darkness of the night seemed to thicken around him, obscuring everything but his silhouette against the dimly lit backdrop of the forest. Nadia finally made it to her village, out of breath and in a state of sheer panic. She relayed what she had seen to some of the village's adults, who immediately formed a group to return to the shed. As they approached, a harrowing sight met their eyes. The once humble wooden structure was engulfed in flames, the fiery tongues reaching skyward, consuming everything in its path. All thoughts of approaching were abandoned as the heat grew intense, but as the flames danced and flickered, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor, Nadia noticed a small pile of neatly folded clothing on the ground. It was right where she had last seen Avon. Her gaze drifted upwards to the place in the sky where she'd seen the 2 twinkling stars. They were gone, erased from the night sky as though they'd never been there at all. By morning, the fire had finally burned itself out, leaving nothing but charred ruins in its wake. A search of the remains uncovered a single burnt corpse lying in the exact center of the shed. Though it was impossible to be sure given the condition of the body, everyone silently agreed that it was Avon. The mystery of the shed, the strange disappearances, and the unsettling events of that night were never truly explained. But one thing was certain: after that fateful evening, no one in the village ever vanished again. Now, for those of you wondering about what came of Nadia after that night, Anton's letter goes on to say that Nadia lived a long and quiet life, eventually moving to a bigger city. She rarely spoke of that night, but whenever she did, it was always with a far-off look in her eyes, as if she were still seeing those flames. She became a mother, a grandmother, and yes, a great-grandmother too. It was her stories, told to young Anton on cold winter nights, that inspired him to write in and share this tale with all of us. And for that, Anton, we thank you. Your family's history, as dark and mysterious as it may be, is a testament to the power of human spirit, resilience, and the unknown wonders and terrors of our world. Now, folks, tonight's episode might be a bit shorter than y'all are used to. No call-ins or musical interlude tonight, but don't you worry, because I've got a weekly tale for you that's been brewing in my mind for a good spell now. So settle in and let's dive even deeper into the mysteries that our world holds. Well, y'all, gather around and let me take you back to the sweltering summer of '78. Over in Leon County, Texas, where the air was thick enough to cut with a knife and the cicadas sang loud enough to drown out any quiet thoughts. I was just a young buck then, leaner and a mite quicker, but with the same thirst for a good story. The company I was working for had gotten a contract to renovate an old building, one of them structures that had seen more yesteryears than any living soul could remember. You know the kind, right? Worn red bricks, cracked wooden beams, and stories passed down from old-timers sipping iced tea on their porches. Now, this building, it had been many things over the years. A general store, a dance hall, and for a brief moment in the roaring 20s, even a speakeasy. But by the time we got to it, it was just a dusty old husk waiting for a new lease on life. My days back then were filled with hauling bricks, sweating like a hog, and getting the occasional splinter. But one afternoon, something peculiar happened. We were tearing down an interior wall, and in between the old wood and peeling wallpaper, I found an aged piece of paper. It was a set of blueprints, but not for the building we knew. This blueprint showed a basement, an entire floor beneath the building we were renovating. But here's the kicker. There wasn't supposed to be no basement, at least not according to any of the official plans or city records. But I'd always had a curious bone in my body, and I figured maybe it was time for a bit of unofficial excavation. So one evening after the sun had set and the Texan heat became a tad more bearable, a few buddies from the crew and I decided to go on a little adventure. We started digging at the spot indicated on the blueprint, our shovels biting into the earth, echoing the promise of a buried mystery. Hours passed, and just when we were about to call it quits, our shovels hit something solid, wooden planks. We had found a doorway. Once we pried those old wooden boards open, a gust of cool, damp air hit us. Now, mind you, in a hot Texan summer, that should have been refreshing, but it wasn't. It felt wrong, like we had stepped into someone else's world. The darkened basement wasn't entirely unlit. A weak glow of light emanated from a lantern left on a table. The scene before us looked like it had been taken straight out of a movie. A makeshift living area with tattered blankets, a couple of old mattresses, and remnants of meals eaten not too long ago. Empty cans of beans, bottled water, even a few pieces of stale bread. One of my pals, Earl, he whispered, "Someone's been living here." And by the looks of it, they hadn't been gone long. The air grew tenser as they ventured further, following a trail of discarded belongings. There were old newspapers, pieces of cloth, and what looked like personal items. Photographs, locks of hair tied with ribbons. Every instinct I had was screaming for us to leave, but I reckon that foolish, youthful bravado had us pressing on. Then at the farthest corner, we saw it, a small, narrow tunnel crudely dug into the earth. It was just large enough for a man to crawl through. We figured this must have been the entrance whoever had been living here had used, seeing as it led in the direction of a wooded area outside the building. One of my co-workers, A tall, broad-shouldered guy named Billy knelt down to inspect the tunnel. He pulled out a flashlight and pointed it inside. The beam of light revealed footprints, fresh ones. I remember thinking we might not be alone, and whoever this was might not take kindly to intruders. The walls of that tunnel seemed to be reinforced with some old boards and bits of metal. But what truly unnerved me were the scratch marks. They looked deliberate, like a message or a code. We had a decision to make: either venture further and confront the unknown, or hightail it out of there. And while I've always had a curious bone in my body, even curiosity has its limits. We decided it was time to leave, but just as we were turning around, we heard it. A low, raspy humming echoing from deep within that tunnel, a tune that sounded neither happy nor sad, but something in between. It sent shivers right down my spine. You'd think that was the end of it, but oh no, things got a whole lot stranger after that night. Now, folks, after that haunting encounter in the basement, we tried to put it behind us. I mean, you gotta pay the bills, right? So we did what we had to. We kept working. The days following the basement discovery were filled with an unease that clung to the air, almost as tangible as the Texas heat. At first, it was just small things. Tools would go missing, only to be found in different parts of the building. Measurements would be off, no matter how many times our guys checked. And then, things took a turn. One morning, Billy came rushing in, pale as a ghost, said he found something near the entrance to the basement. It was a dead rabbit. It was like it was meticulously placed, its limbs stretched out, surrounded by an odd array of twigs and stone. I wish I could say that was it. But a couple days later, there was another, then another. As days turned to weeks, more dead animals began to appear. Birds, squirrels, even a baby deer once, all displayed in the same way. It was clear that someone or something was watching, waiting, and didn't want us there. A couple of my buddies quit. I don't blame them. Those of us that stayed, we pressed on, driven by a mix of stubbornness and necessity. The job needed to be finished, and we were determined to see it through. But the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were hushed. Lunch breaks were filled with whispered theories and nervous glances. Some of the guys even started wearing crucifixes or bringing in religious things, hoping they might ward off whatever was plaguing our sight. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the disturbances ceased. No more dead animals. No more missing tools. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted. One evening after the job was all said and done, me and a couple of the boys, Jimmy and Travis, we went out to this little hole-in-the-wall joint, the Hail Lid, I think it was called. Real out there in the sticks, but they had the coldest beer around. We were laughing, swapping stories, just blowing off steam from the job. I must have had one too many sodas because I found myself needing to step outside to, well, water the plants. It was a moonlit night, just enough light for me to see my way around, but as I was standing there, something caught my eye. Way off in the distance, a pale figure just watching me. Couldn't make out a face, just those unblinking eyes catching the moonlight. I ain't proud to admit it, but I zipped up and dashed back inside quicker than a raccoon caught in the trash. Told the boys what I saw, and they laughed, thinking maybe I'd had one too many. But I knew what I saw. Fast forward a couple hours, we're all ready to head home. Stomachs full of beer, spirits high, but as we approached my old power wagon, my heart sank. Someone or something had taken something sharp to it. Deep scratches all across the side, like a wild animal had gone at it, or someone with a deep-seated grudge. Now, could it have been some local troublemakers? Sure. But given everything that had been going on, I can't help but think those incidents were connected. That whoever or whatever had been watching us at that job site had followed me. Well, folks, it just goes to show you, sometimes the past has a way of catching up, even when you least expect it. And sometimes the scariest stories aren't about things that go bump in the night, but about the very real people out there with their own tales of woe. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Delta Deep. Remember, keep your doors locked, your friends close, and always listen to that gut feeling. It might just save you one day. This is Roscoe signing off. Stay safe out there in the deep, listeners. Until next time.